Today, I am joined by Ben Powell, founder of the Climate Debate UK and also a cabinet member on Together Association. You are a climate researcher, let's say, and have recently published a paper called Clean Air, Dirty Money and Filthy Politics. Welcome to the programme, Ben.
Thanks very much, Mike. It's great to be here.
Let's get started. I mean, the title of the paper is pretty clear because dirty money and filthy politics seems to be the situation that we're in at the moment. And what struck me about the paper as I read it was you're talking about so many of the things that we have been covering over many, many years, C40 cities and so on, the whole cities agenda, and the fact that cities are absolutely leading the way in terms of pursuing the climate agenda, the net zero agenda, and they're using increasingly clean air as the mechanism to sort of drive that in the first place.
That's right. Yeah, we think of that as like kind of pretty much a symptom of the failure of the green agenda so far. In fact, so we produced another report earlier on in the year, looking at the science of air pollution claims, such as Sadiq Khan's claim that 4,000 people die from air pollution in London each year, which is just nonsense. And actually, you can find scientists being very frank about the fact that this is nonsense, and even through sort of committees that the government have convened. And actually, the chair of that committee is also the chair of Imperial College. The body at Imperial College London that sort of now services Sadiq Khan's claims with science, so-called. But it's not peer-reviewed science, and it's not scientific even. It's just sort of statistical modelling. But anyway, the point is, what we wanted to know really was, well, why does this persist? Why do these kind of claims persist throughout public life, through politics? Why are politics so sort of reluctant to accept that challenges to this view, and sort of listen to critics of those claims? And I think I don't know if this report's going to tell anyone who watches this kind of show anything they didn't necessarily already know, but we did think it was important to sort of make it in a formal. To create a very sort of formal argument about how this new form of politics works, what the kind of structures are, and what's dominant in it. Because it's clearly not democratic, right? It's clearly not the case that people are or ever were marching in the street demanding tighter air pollution controls and demanding that the government takes away their cars and restricts their access to roads. So where does it come from? And we already knew, but we show that philanthropists have this undue role, this outsized role in global politics, and pretty much in the case of some very, very big players like Bill Gates, of course, and Mike Bloomberg, arguably they've just bought their way in. Now, it's fine, in a sense, I think, to argue that civil society organizations and to a greater or lesser or extent sort of some intergovernmental agencies might require philanthropy to survive, especially in the case of charities. But we point out that it's more the case that billionaires are able to buy civil society, not just civil society organizations. What we're doing here now is civil society, but we're against the dominant part of civil society, which doesn't have any real connection with the public. It's all top down. It's all from these very lofty philanthropic organizations that just sort of set things up. They can just, conjure up organizations to suit their needs as they arise. And so that's kind of a departure from how we might have once understood politics. Particularly democratic politics in this country is mostly organized around a contest of ideas between broadly competing parties representing different interests in society.
Let's look at this in a little bit more detail, because you've talked about philanthropists and you've talked about civil society organizations, which we might call charities. NGOs are another aspect of this.
That's right. Yeah.
But and then on top of that as well, there are, for example, C40 Cities, UK 100, a whole bunch of other, the Global Parliament of Mayors, a whole bunch of other organizations and institutions which have been established and have really gained a lot of traction in the last 20 or 30 years, which are completely outside what people would perceive as being the normal democratic process. The majority of people probably don't even know they exist. I mean, if we took a straw poll of people in the UK and said, have you heard of the Global Parliament of Mayors? Very, very few people will have heard of that or know anything about it. And so this is all going on in plain sight. And us as the electorate, as people that think we live in a democracy, have played no part in the establishment of these organizations and play no part in holding them to account. So how has this happened, and how has this crept up on us, and what do you think the steps are that we need to take to deal with it?
Well, I think there are a number of hypotheses about the genesis of this kind of, what would you call it, philanthropic industrial complex, and I think Vivek Ramaswamy's book, I think it's called Woke Inc., does shed some light on that, perhaps being a system that kind of developed under Obama, whereby there was, I believe, tax breaks or some such thing for philanthropic gestures, and that pushed a lot of money into causes that were, more or less aligned with the Democratic Party's sort of consensus or ideological priorities or what have you. So I think that was probably the shot in the arm over the last over the Obama era and since. But this is a longer thing, and people. What would you say? Veterans of the climate wars, I suppose you would say, have known that this has been going on since the 1960s. That very powerful people, very rich people, have variously, or not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but a nucleus of them certainly began to sort of believe in the 1960s in this Malthusian principle and to try and reinvent the work of Thomas Malthus that was sort of aimed to restrict the human fertility. They spent billions on trying to reduce population in the developing world. So they were kind of gripped by this idea, and they were able to set themselves up through the United Nations. Through them, this was an oil tycoon, Maurice Strong, and that really established environmentalism in the UN, and that the United Nations Environment Programme, very much led by Strong and his fellow philanthropists, these billionaires like the Rockefellers, and it's kind of snowballed since then. And I think it's very global politics is very attractive to national politics. So someone like our favorite demon, Tony Blair. He's much more drawn to the glamour and what have you of a global institution, of these enormous sort of political structures, rather than just the sort of slightly boring day-to-day stuff that characterizes domestic UK politics. So, so there's been an attempt to rebuild, to sort of build political institutions at the global level going on since the foundations of the United Nations, since the first days, or even before. If you take the League of Nations as representative of the same effort, so there's always been a dream of global government for good and bad reasons, and that a lot of people have invested their philanthropy in it and their hopes for a different form of politics than the one we're sort of used to. So I think these kind of things coincide and or align And so the United Nations cannot be can't be dominated by a form of politics, for example, that characterizes the ideologies of the early 20th century. If it's left wing or right wing as such, then there's going, the political project is not going to be able to sustain itself, because it will obviously rub against democratic principles where people choose about what kind of ideologies that their governments, or what the organizing principles of their governments are. So the United Nations has to sort of present itself as above ideology, and people for some reason have sort of come to believe that environmentalism isn't ideological, that this idea about how society must be organized in order to save the planet is just a technical matter, not a matter of ideologies such as those that characterized the early 20th century. But it is, right? It is just as ideological, because it says we must be organized in this way. The whole of society, the whole of the economy must be radically reorganized in short order. And then, of course, it just so happens that the people who benefit from that are global technocrats, are billionaires, and that's how they can. Their interests are going to be served in this sort of green utopia that they designed for us. They're not going to be losers in this in the green utopia. Yeah. So I mean, so those are the two main strands: is this development of the United Nations and the development of philanthropy as a sort of a political force in and of its own right. Probably the more recent part of that.
Yes, and I mean, an example of what you're talking about is Mr. Starmer himself, when he was asked whether he prefers Parliament or the World Economic Forum, and the answer was absolutely the World Economic Forum. That was sort of my next question. I mean, we've talked about NGOs, CSOs, we've talked about bodies like C40 Cities and Global Parliament of Mayors and so on, but where do you see bodies like the World Economic Forum or the Bilderberg Group or CFR, these types of organizations fitting into all this? Are they just part of the puzzle, or do they have a bigger role? Or in fact, following on from that, do you think the role of the World Economic Forum is overstated?
I do, and that tends to annoy people. But I don't want to think of it as a sort of yes, no, true, false kind of thing. There are dozens of, or at least a dozen, organizations like the WEF and the Bilderberg, and I think they've got an interest in overstating their ability to influence things. And so when I was writing the report on air pollution, for example, it doesn't really come up in the machinations. And of course, there are WEF meetings and what have you about air pollution and climate change, but I don't necessarily see them as the instigators. So I don't want to give them too much credit for what they don't necessarily deserve and haven't necessarily created. Or the way I look at them is more like unsupervised sixth form discos preceding an outbreak of chlamydia. If you can compare ideology to an STD, all these people, they just move around in these kind of conferences and meetings and boondoggles and beanos and what have you, and it rubs off on each other. They align through this kind of quite bland, insidious process that doesn't take away the evil of it. Like this is not where decisions and ideologies should be made. Like that, the democratic. Well, decision making should be democratic. We should be able to participate in that. And of course, these exclusive clubs are exactly that. They're going to say no public allowed, no people allowed. To bring that back to the report, it seemed to me that with figures like Bill Gates pushing sums like $4.7 billion into organizations like the World Health Organization, funding UK universities to the tune of $300+ million each. That's not a year. That's in total. But they're giving vast budgets to research in the UK and throughout the world, and they're dominating civil society. Just the handful of billionaires that we look at: Bill Gates, Mike Bloomberg, Christopher Hone, Jeremy Grantham. The WEF. Those are sums that are far bigger than the WEF, and they encompass much more of society than just Davos man, who used to be, by the way. He was just an object of ridicule in the 2010s. Davos man was quite naff figure who was sort of burdened by the latest gadgets, gizmos, and fashionable causes. He wasn't a serious person. It's a bit of a spiv, really, and not someone who is capable of executing a world plan. And I think we should actually perhaps even look at these billionaires in the same way. And it's not necessarily the case that like the guy in The Simpsons, the evil power station guy. They've got this program. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so like kind of, it's almost as civil society has been established to just completely flatter the egos of these already very narcissistic and psychopathic people. So they may themselves be victims of ideology. It's not necessarily like scripts and plans and and what have you. It's the if you like, the abomination is just in the configuration of politics in this way, not necessarily the documents that reveal what their agenda is. And I appreciate that's nuanced, and some people might say, well, what difference does that make to me? But that certainly works both ways. I don't think that billionaires should be able to give gifts with strings to intergovernmental agencies and civil society organizations with such influence in public life. So I don't need the WEF or the Bilderbergs to explain that position. I just need to say I don't want this. I don't like their ideas. I think they're wrong. I think they distort science research across the board. They distort not just scientific research. They they distort social and economic research and all kinds. They form cabals, and that's one of the things we point out in the report. Even 20 years ago, researchers into malaria and other transmissible diseases, particularly those that affect the third world, they were complaining that philanthropy, specifically from Gates, has this toxic effect on research. It distorts the priorities of research and replaces them with the agenda of the philanthropists. So, and we know Gates, for example, is preoccupied with vaccines. Well, malaria was eliminated in much of the West, in Europe and in America, in North America, and even as far north as the Arctic Circle, not through vaccines. People went out with a lot of pesticide, and where there were malaria mosquitoes, they were wiped out. Now that may or may not have ecological problems. But that was the approach we took, or forward thinking. In fact, governments and regulators took in order to address a very serious problem that would not be tolerated today. And you can be sure that if something of that order did return today, people would be pretty quickly demanding that kind of solution. That begins to shift this philanthropy shifts the center of gravity of those discussions and scientific research in institutions where strings should not be attached. We want scientists to pursue what is of interest to scientists. And we want social researchers similarly to be independent of these ideological agendas. That doesn't mean that they don't have their own ideological agendas or are not vulnerable to them, but the point of science is to reconcile those kind of differences in society. So yeah, so probably long-winded to say. I just think this kind of dominance of philanthropy is unhealthy, and I think we can start there more simply than we can with other sort of forms of criticism about WEFs and so on.
If philanthropists were really charitable, they would just give the money to whoever just as everybody else does. They would
Absolutely.
give the money to whoever they think is doing a good job, and that would be it. But as you say, conditionalities are attached, and therefore there is an agenda at work here. But if we just look at the funding for scientific research at the moment, you've mentioned Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but I mean, who else is directly funding this type of research in terms of clean air and climate policy?
Just on those specifics, I mean, the point of the research is we sort of try and demonstrate three tiers to this because because it was necessary to sort of explain the context of what we were talking about. So at the top, we point out there is the likes of Bill Gates, and he spent an enormous amount of money over the course of the development of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think it's in the order of $85 billion. Dollars, but I don't have the figures in front of me, and he's kind of I argue that's quite simply buying his way into these intergovernmental agencies and so on and so forth. That's as I've explained. Then there's a second tier, which is more the green billionaires, and they're kind of beginning to buy their way in the same way. And the three that we look at there are Mike Bloomberg, the news media guy, and the developer of the Bloomberg terminal, which sort of transmits financial information extremely rapidly around the world, and Christopher Hone, who's the UK billionaire hedge fund manager, and Jeremy Grantham, who's he's a bit of a smaller deal, but he's interesting because he funds very expensive units bearing his name at the London School of Economics and Imperial College, and I think he's given those in the order of about 30 million of some denomination each. And then the third tier is just showing how the air pollution is a proxy battle of the climate war. So in fact, it's just those money from climate philanthropists that is making its way to the air pollution campaigns. So and the second tier is developing along the same lines as the first tier, and air pollution anxieties are just the annex of the climate wars, right?
Something I wanted to ask you specifically about here was, and if I've misread this in the report, then say so. But if we look at, for example, the Foreign Commonwealth Office and the way that they distribute money around the world, they up to a point were publishing all spending over £25,000. And they would send money to a particular organisation, but then that organisation would then distribute that money further down the chain. And so what effectively was happening was that the money was being laundered, so that you never knew that it was actually that a particular NGO that was working in a country was actually being funded by the Foreign Commonwealth Office via these other intermediaries. And I was just wondering whether, I think I read that in the report, that's kind of the same model that's being used in this case as well.
Yeah, possibly. We looked less at that than I would have liked to have done. It needs more work. We only have, we've got incredibly limited resources. Not being funded by billionaires. So I was, only able to take a few weeks to do this. The Dev Tracker info that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office do put out is really interesting, and it was very. I've seen it quite a lot, sort of leveraging quite a lot of money, the billionaires' money. They seem to amplify their money through government largesse. You could find at the Foreign Commonwealth Office donations to the World Wildlife Fund of £30 million, and you can find their funding. The most bizarre I found, which we discuss, is this organization called Client Earth, which uses judicial reviews, takes governments and companies to courts to try and advance the green agenda. The government's given them £4 million so far that we've found, and yet they have taken the government to court at least 9 times on the issue of air pollution. I think that was by 2019, and I think there have been a number of cases since, which is just absolutely. I mean, who's heard of a plaintiff being funded by a defendant in a lawsuit? That's kind of crazy, isn't it? Like, kind of, I'm paying you to sue me. Yeah, that's the situation. That's the absurdity of the situation we're in. Of course, Client Earth is not solely funded by the government. It's funded by mostly the billionaires we've discussed, and I think even Pink Floyd's guitarist, is it Dave Gilmour? He gave them about 16 million quid, I believe. So they're pretty bloated already with green billionaire cash. So why the UK government is funding them, I've no idea. But that perversity in funding these legal campaigns is reflected in a lot of the funding that you can see from green organization to green organizations from the government. So it's all. I think more towards the end of the report, and it's something I've argued elsewhere as well. There's something of a compact developing between business, government, and civil society. And given that civil society is just a product, or just owned by business, we can say it's a compact between governments and business, or governments and billionaires, if we want to go that far. And that's the danger. And you hear the likes of former president of COP26, Alok Sharma, MP for Reading West. He was this sort of slightly pathetic figure, given this sort of huge planet-saving role. And he gives this fascinating speech to the Green Alliance, this blob outfit in Westminster, quite an old one, but a blob outfit all the same. He uses the word civil society in this sort of presentation about what about COP26 and the plans. He uses the expression civil society like more 10 or so times. He never talks about the public. Right, so the public just don't feature in the thinking of these kind of wonks, these technocrats, the people that sort of inhabit the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. They just do think of the whole of the world in terms of civil society organisations and the great and good that they can do. Leaving out any questions about whether the public agrees with what these vast budgets. This is billions. This is 2% of GDP, which it was, which is what Cameron wanted to use as the aid budget. And people, and I think that this is the trick of this is. Cameron will say we want to use 2% of GDP to as aid, and everyone will think of starving babies in Africa, and we're going to go and give them some food. We might build them some houses. We might restore their agricultural land so they can use it. No, it's going to this kind of questionable university research departments and civil society organizations and other intergovernmental agencies and so on to try and further this green agenda globally. So for example, you look at some West African country that may be the putative beneficiary of £5 million. And then you discover, well, it's half of that's going to the World Resources Institute, and half of that's going to, which is just a Stern, Nicholas Stern outfit with Jeremy Grantham's influence and so on and so forth. And then there might be a few regional NGOs that take a few of the crumbs. But what the point of this project is to help somewhere like Ethiopia develop its nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement, or under the Paris Agreement. So this looks like aid. This looks like going to help hungry Africans, but actually it's just strengthening the Paris Agreement. It's buying and bribing officials in other countries to adhere to the UK government's preferred global political institutions and treaties and so on and so forth. So none of that gets discussed, and I've done a few dives on those funds because I remember there's probably a distraction from the air pollution discussion, but a few months ago, aid to India became a big thing because India just put a spacecraft on the moon, which is great. And then people were saying, "Hold on, we're spending all these millions on aid in India." And then if you go and look at what the money is actually going towards, it's stuff like creating apps to help people. So there was a few million quid that went to software developers in India to develop apps for people's smartphones so that they could live sustainable, they could have sustainable lifestyle tips or what have you. Completely daft. And I think what that's trying to do is to buy a part of Indian society to try and change values in there, so that people. So there's 200 or 300 people in India now who have got buy-in to Western environmental ideological precepts. Right? And that's how this stuff is intended to work, but you won't hear that kind of thing discussed in mainstream discussions about aid. They'll go back, it's on the BBC. They'll be talking about the devastating floods or famines or what have you that people elsewhere have to deal with. So it's a great big scam.
This is all the same policy being expressed in many ways. Now, the question I had for you was, therefore, politicians are not representing our wishes. They're not representing us in any way. They're representing policies to us, it seems to me. And therefore, at best, all we have is a veneer of democracy here.
It's a non-democracy here. You can a management style. And that the only contest that really exists between, for example, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak is a fake debate about who's competent to run the state. It's not about anything deeper, about any of the principles, the organising principles at stake. There are none, because they're just too. Well, everyone knows they're puppets. Even people who would vote Labour or Tory. Know that Rishi Sunak doesn't represent them and Keir Starmer doesn't. They know that. I think the best thing in the world that could happen would be if both Tories and Labour and the others got together and said, we won't vote for our party if you don't vote for your party, because we both know that they're completely corrupted. Labour doesn't represent the working class, and Conservatives don't represent the traditional values that party used to stand for. And Liberal Democrats, of course, are neither liberal nor democratic. And there's a question mark over whether the Green Party are actually green. So like that being the case, they've all sort of arrived at a consensus position on these issues. And what we show in the report is it was a consensus that was engineered by the Green Alliance, which is I mentioned them a few moments ago. This sort of think tank, very, very rooted in Westminster. It's not massive. It doesn't have budgets of tens of millions or anything, but it has a lot of influence in Westminster, and they were behind instigating the climate assembly, a sort of big experiment against democracy a few years ago, that sort of coincided with the arrival of Extinction Rebellion, and they organised this campaign in the 2015 general election. I think it's called Show the Love. And they basically lobbied the leaders of the parties, the three main parties, David Cameron, of course, Ed Miliband, who was Labour leader at the time, and Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democrats. And there's this picture of them all signing this pledge not to debate climate policy, but to all agree to sort of emphasise the Paris Agreement and tackling climate change in their policy agendas. So sort of agreement to put the green blob before the interests of the public, and to allow the public a view. And I think people would recognise that not just in climate change now, but across the board. It's really difficult I can only really go on about climate change, but I think people will recognise that woke has established itself in the political establishment at large, not necessarily just in Westminster, along the same lines. Racial ideology, gender ideology, all of the and green ideologies, and they're all pretty much a piece, and they've all sort of set themselves in Westminster in this kind of way, and at the expense of us participating in politics and deciding what principles should be key to policy making. I don't want to return to the 1970s, for example, when you had, these horrible disputes between Labour and, as it were, capital, or Labour, between. We don't want strikes again, right? Mm. But we do want there to be a dialogue of some kind between differing perspectives in society. Otherwise, those differences in society are going to fester, and they're going to be dangerous. That those schisms are going to become dangerous. That's why we have democracy, is because it's the best way of resolving tensions that develop within society. But if you've got a whole political establishment which is very easily bought into these sort of fluffy consensuses that have billions of pounds of PR surrounding them, what's going to happen? And I think it's really important to remember that as these politicians were trying to build the consensus around climate change, we were going into a referendum where really the public had been denied this view for a really long time, been denied the ability to give a view on Britain's membership of the European Union for such a long time. And that had grown and grown and grown until it was such a problem for David Cameron that he was forced to give people a consensus. And then they threw the whole resources of the state behind trying to sort of nudge people into making the right choice. So there couldn't be a more vivid demonstration about the difference between the democratic deficit. Not everyone, of course, because it didn't turn into it wasn't 100%, but the largest sort of the dominant issue as far as the public were concerned for the preceding 15 or 20 years was the question of Britain's membership of the EU, whereas the dominant question as far as Westminster was concerned was what happens if it gets 2 degrees warmer, right? That's just this. So people were saying, we want democratic control of policy because there's all this stuff that's going on that's terrible. We've got this growing immigration problem. We've got this growing housing problem. And we've got all these economic problems that haven't been resolved. And you're all dancing around in Europe worrying about climate change. We need to bring politics back. Back to democracy, and the likes of Ed Miliband wandering around with their heads in the clouds on the global stage just didn't recognise that. Still don't recognise that democratic deficit as something that needs to be resolved. So that's kind of an important aspect to understanding how air pollution fears and crises develop. This is their context, right? It's this democratic deficit that creates this kind of distorted view on the other side that the likes of Ed Miliband and other politicians are victims of. And what we really point out in that part of the report is that global climate politics, it kind of comes to a halt in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, and perhaps knocked a bit for six as well by Britain's vote, the Leave vote, and also by Donald Trump's election. Right, these are two kind of earthquakes that unsettled globalists, if you like, in their ideologies. And so there's a recognition that the Paris Agreement essentially allows everyone to set their own emissions targets, whereas in the past the hope was you could get one size fits all. Everyone would agree it's such an emergency, we all have to impose this one policy now, and then every country has to deal with it. But now it's this sort of fake agreement to disagree. So it's an agreement to disagree, basically. And so climate politics has to shift. It has to go somewhere else. And where it goes is local. Because as we've seen now, there's a lot of fallout about Rishi Sunak's plans to abolish. He says he'd put back the deadline for abolishing petrol and diesel cars to 2035 to bring it into alignment with other countries. This is enormously politically toxic for national governments. So climate policies don't work at the global level. They don't really work at the national level. So they've been trying to find ways to push climate policy making to local politics, where of course turnouts are extremely low. And so I don't think any London mayor, for example, has ever had a turnout at an election of more than 45%. And of course, they're getting barely more than half of that total vote in the second round. So they can't really claim that very many Londoners support any mayor that there's ever been. I think I think people have pointed out, more people voted Brexit in London than voted for Sadiq Khan, which is this remarkable disparity given the ambition that Khan has to abolish everyone's cars. Anyway, so giving powers, as it were, to local authorities, essentially to exceed what people would believe to be local authorities' powers, is where the climate agenda has ended up. And so, banning cars is done on the basis of air pollution at the local level, not as climate change at the national or global level. And it's done in the context of extremely weak democratic engagement. I've given the example of London, but in many local elections throughout the UK, the turnouts are as low as the low teens. So and that's for for all parties. So you could there could be a council that has just the support, a mandate given to it by single digit percentage of the local population. Yet what they want to do is extremely radical, even by national government standards. So they is a huge change to the way we live our lives. Radically changes the informal social care that goes on. It radically changes the opportunities that you can give children, and it radically it changes how you get to work, and so on and so forth. But that is the competence that's been assumed by local governments. And what I found fascinating about this, because we were saying, well, what's that got to do with billionaires like Mike Bloomberg? Well, Mike Bloomberg was mayor for 3 terms of New York City. And I've been talking about turnouts, and the turnout in New York was catastrophically low. I think it's got 25%. And in his 3rd term in office, Bloomberg spent, for every single vote that he achieved, $186, which is, I mean, he spent more on his mayoral election than all UK political parties spend on a general election campaign. And for a city the size of London, for a job like Sadiq Khan's, I mean, it's just an extraordinary amount of money. So my suggestion is, this indicates that local government, not just in the States, we've got the same problems here, are completely vulnerable to money.
Yeah.
And they're completely vulnerable to these fake civil society organizations. And so being completely open to the power of money, that was the obvious place for climate politics to go from global to local. And Mike Bloomberg has seen it. And if you look at Mike Bloomberg's presence at COP28, which is happening now, he's running this strand on local politics. He's running the show, literally running the show, and discussing how they can further buy their way in to local politics to essentially circumvent democracy at national and local levels. But in case that sounds gloomy, because local elections have such low turnouts, we have a huge opportunity here to organise independent campaigns to stand against those candidates that are so vulnerable to the green blob, and so that we can overturn this, and that's why citizen journalism and organisations and campaigns like Together are so important to help that process.
Well, absolutely, and of course, people will be often pessimistic about local politics and getting involved in local politics, but it's a great way to get a message to an audience without requiring the mainstream media, and that's really what I want to ask you about next. Because obviously none of this could happen if the media was doing its job and was actually helping to hold politics at whatever form of politics it is to account. And contrary to that, they have demonstrated in the last 10, 20 years to be absolutely on board with policy rather than holding policy to account. So I just wondering what you think about mainstream media.
Oh, well, I try not to. I mean, I don't. I try not to. I used to just turn it. It used to be tuned on to my radio. My radio used to be Radio 4 in the kitchen. It's something I listened to from my childhood into my 30s. The BBC, and I just don't recognize it. First of all, I just don't. I mean, of course, there were always sort of leftoids and ideologues and what have you at the BBC, and but that was all added to the richness of the experience, I think. And I turn it on that, and I just couldn't. Maybe I'm standing like a grumpy old man. Yeah, I didn't recognise the Britain that they were portraying. I didn't recognise any of the issues that they were claiming were sort of ought to be dominant. And the same with the the TV. I probably switched off many years earlier. Although I used to remember thinking Channel 4 was really amazing.
Ben, Channel 4 used to be, in terms of mainstream media news, Channel 4 News used to be pretty much top line. And if you remember back in 2009, 2010, they exposed the swine flu scam that was trying to be pushed on the world at that time. And then go forward 10 years, and they were absolutely 100% behind the COVID narrative as well. So that something changed there. But I wasn't even, BBC and broadcast news. That's one thing, but also we've still got the newspapers. And of course, The Guardian in particular have been on the receiving end of quite a lot of the philanthropic money that you were talking about earlier in this interview. So there is definitely influence coming through from the same kinds of sources that are influencing academia and politics. So the other change that happened, of course, over the COVID period is they started being directly funded by government for advertising in a way that they hadn't been up to that point as well. I just wonder how much of that is the reason that they are refusing to actually engage in these topics.
Again, the sums are pretty large, and that's only the ones we've been able to uncover. A lot of money going from Bill Gates to the World Service end of the BBC, not necessarily the license fee funded part of the BBC. I think the BBC, and there's some very interesting documents around 2016 from the BBC's charitable arm, BBC Media Action. Which feeds into a lot of BBC World Service programming, which in turn gets pushed out variously across the network. So the BBC's fact-checking unit is funded through this stuff. It's also quite a beneficiary of quite a generous grant from central government as well, which has the same preoccupations. But around 2016 is when all of this panic about misinformation begins, and this the fake news stuff, and I think it's because the BBC, being the main instrument of the political establishment at large, I would say, not necessarily the government or the state, but the political class. It sort of represents. Its most prominent sort of institution is of course the BBC, and it's terrified. If you read these kind of discussions in the BBC that about what's just happened, Trump's just been elected, Brexit's just been voted for. And they're like, oh my gosh, what have we allowed to happen? We were supposed to be the centre of gravity of everyone's opinion in the whole UK. We national agenda. We were supposed to be presenting to people the view of the world, and they feel like they failed. So they kind of doubled down. And I think the other broadcasters and a lot of the rest of the media were in their orbit, but I think they've doubled down too hard. So I think that so we might see these quite large sums going, like in the order of $50 million going from Bill Gates to the BBC, 12 million I think to the Guardian, and even some to the Telegraph. But it's not going to work now, because there's a disjuncture now, and too many people have read it and too many people have seen it. So now people are just switching off the BBC, precisely because it's just become this bland conformism that doesn't explore any issue to any depth. And as much someone could say, oh, you just got this view that's an outlier, that's out of kilter. That's much more interesting to people than sort of authorized consensuses about the correct scientific opinion. People want to hear about debates. People want to hear about differences of perspective, and people don't want to be spoon-fed bland piety through their TV. And that's why they're switching off. But none of the broadcasters recognize it. I think Channel 4 just blew £5 million on sort of reinventing their logo and making films about how they did it. But then that just leaves £5 million they're not spending on the content. They're all logo and no product, right? But they're not interesting enough a logo to stick on people's T-shirts or something. So they've become in this kind of way preoccupied with themselves as brands and sort of their relationship to society at the expense of actually serving any good in society. So I think people have turned off. So again, I wouldn't be too bleak about the dominance of mainstream media, because apart from anything else, we're here now. We're doing this now. This probably wasn't possible to the extent that it is now before COVID and before climate, before net zero, and before wokeness. So every kind of trench that that establishment position digs as its own kind of defenses undermines its own foundations. People want stuff like this, and the more people that sort of find it, the more they will watch it, and the more that the BBC and Channel 4 and the mainstream newspapers are defensive about it, the more they will drive people away. That's been the tendency. So long may they continue. But that is also why they're getting very aggressive about online harms and misinformation and other stuff. So we have to be careful. It's not a done deal. There's a lot more they could do to prevent freedom of expression, and that they are planning to do. And we've got to be careful to it. But I think we should be, again, optimistic about mainstream media's demise. I think it is imminent, and it will be a good thing.
I can't leave without talking about air quality itself, and a bit, one of the points that's made in the paper is that, of course, the air quality debate isn't based on science, and so whenever Sadiq Khan is claiming that he needs an ultra low emission zone because air quality is bad in London and 4,000 people are dying a year and so on, what is the scientific evidence on his correctness or incorrectness on that?
There is no science of it, first of all, right? So there was an attempt to estimate the mortality risk of air pollution exposure, and that is based on a broader number of studies, and it's quite simple. You sort of try to estimate a population's level of exposure, and then you look at how long they're living, and then you try to work out what the influence of those air pollutants, specifically PM 2.5, which is the smallest particles of soot and the such like in air, and stuff like the NOxes and SOxes, nitrogen dioxides, and nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides. So they try to build these statistical models of that exposure risk. And now, as useful, they may well be useful in certain contexts, and I'm not against. I think it's probably better that we don't have open coal fires in a place like London. I think that so, but I don't. We're talking about something categorically different when we're talking about banning anything. We're essentially talking about banning combustion, full stop, of any form. So the government had convened in the 2000s, or they sort of met occasionally, a panel of experts called the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollutants. It's called COMIAP. And that sort of brought these sort of researchers and scientists together, with a couple of lay people, interestingly enough, again, a representative from the Green Alliance, that blob organization I've discussed quite a bit. And they discuss how can we work out what is the mortality risk. And they try every few years to sort of synthesize the science that's available. So in the one of the sort of key events, there is a report they produced in 2018, where there's sort of more definitive effort to estimate mortality risk of all the pollutants that people are exposed to, and they produced this model. But a lot of the scientists on the panel, or a number of the scientists on the panel, it's not a huge panel, they disagree, and they say this is not a safe way of informing policy. There is no mortality risk associated with air pollution exposure, and we know that because people are living longer lives, right? So it's misleading to say that someone dies because of exposure to air pollution. Now, it might be that you live slightly longer if you're exposed to slightly or much less air pollution, but these effects are extremely weak statistically. So as we point out in the earlier report, life expectancy has been growing through most of the 20th century and into the 21st century pretty linearly at a rate of 72 days per person per year. So, this is life expectancy increasing at this quite phenomenal rate, certainly a historically unprecedented development. So people where they were sort of at the middle of the last century dying towards the end of their 60s, now they're living into their 80s as an average, as an expected norm. So this is, and that's great. We want this, but so the worst you can say about exposure to air pollution, according to these models, is that 72 days per year increase is slowed down by 64 or so hours a year. Right, so you essentially, let's say, you gain 72 days a year through whatever is driving normal material progress, that kind of stuff, and then you lose 60. So 100 steps forward, 1 steps back. Right, that's how to think of this, and and that's why it's misleading to say it causes death or it causes premature death, because it doesn't. It just slightly, air pollution exposure slightly slows the rate of increase of life expectancy. So this debate happens within COMIAP, and a couple of the scientists say we're not putting our name to this because this is misleading and it's going to distort the public's understanding of air pollution. And they say this in 2018, and Sadiq Khan has proven them right. Because Sadiq Khan, I hate, we've got to repeat the point. I'm not claiming a denier's position, for example, that some people might sort of characterize as my views on climate change. I'm stating the science here, literally the published government official science. It's saying, do not use mortality as a statement of the risk of air pollution. But they, the likes of Sadiq Khan just ignore that warning, that advice from science itself. And I would say scientific institutions, research organizations, such as those that are based at Imperial College, are complicit and even the chair of COMIAP itself has been complicit in allowing, as it were, Sadiq Khan to get away with that. And I'm not suggesting that that's just because they've been bought, although we can see extremely large amounts of money flowing between City Hall in London, the Mayor's office, and the NGOs and philanthropists involved with air pollution campaigning. But the whole thing might be more complex than just about funding. But there's definitely ideology interfering with institutional science's contributions to our understanding. And even after having produced such a clear statement as COMIAP did, its chair is going around supporting the mayor in his very alarmist propagandist kind of interventions.
Yeah.
Trying to, this policy making. So this and that's just to wrap that up, I guess. That's how we can know that climate change is BS as well, because air pollution, as I've said before, is a microcosm, is a proxy battle of the climate debate. And if we can see such liberties being taken by institutional science and by scientists in this field, in the field of air pollution, we can definitely see that replicated throughout the other debates about climate change. So that's what we try and do in the report. We try and say air pollution is the microcosm of the broader climate and green agenda, and we can see these same things happening.
Brilliant. Ben, we have to leave it there for today. I hope we can do this again in the future. In the meantime, how do people get a copy of the report, and how do they see your other work?
Yeah, you can get the report at the Together Association website. You'll forgive me if I've forgotten the URL, but it's quite easy to find. You can find it on Twitter as well. We're tweeting it every day at the moment. You can also find me on Twitter, Climate Resistance, CLIM, number 8 Resistance. My website is climatedebate.co.uk. We've also got YouTube channel, but all those are linked to on Twitter and on the website. But yeah, it should be easy to find the report, either by my name or by the Together Association with the word report, if you want to do a web search.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben Powell. Thank you for joining me today. And as I say, hopefully we will see you in the not too distant future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye for now.